Nothing was changing. The Rakrok tribe is unable to change the impossible. The leader of the Black Scale tribe looks like a strong warrior, but even so, they are savages who don't even know what a bow and arrow is. If only they were moved to sacrifice first, the children could survive for a while. Owen had no choice but to ask the children to live a little longer. He would definitely make lizards come to the frogs. The sun was illuminating the land with its warmth. The lizardmen brought the frogmen a water buffalo as a gift. Frogmen did not hide their delight and were very much overjoyed. Rakrok had said earlier that he would bring a live buffalo, and he kept his word to him. It seemed like a great trade for a bow, but Shuning was not convinced. Then Owen suggested that his chief do things a little differently in order for there to be a trade in it. Weapons. They could start getting to know each other through sincere conversations. It was a great idea. Besides, they didn't know anything about the Black Scale tribe yet and invited them to visit the frogs' village. Just then, they would be able to give them the bow. Doesn't this seem like a good opportunity to get to know each other? Rakrok Arrow fell to the ground after flying some distance. Jael asked him how he was doing this time, to which he replied that his arrows only flight half the distance that the frog shot. Looking at the bows they had managed to make by following example, he added that he didn't know what kind of creatures' tendons they used in their bows. Jael reminded Rakrok that their 5th meeting was coming up and that they were probably going to find out as much information about them as they could. Continuing to stare at the arrow stuck in the ground, he replied that it was obvious that they were up to something, but the biggest problem was that they didn't know when and what frogmen were going to do, so they had to be on high alert, which was exhausting, both mentally and physically. But in spite of all this, it was not in their plans to give up. So after saying that they had made some progress today, he asked Jael about the medicinal herbs that were supposed to be effective against the itching disease, to which he replied that the herbalist knew a place where there was enough of them. This was great news. But at the moment, Rakrok was most concerned about Owen, who he thought would be the key to their plan. Jael was clearly more determined than him, so the very next moment, she offered to give him a chance, which could be a great opportunity for them. At the same time, the delegation of frogmen, along with Owen, were on their way to their 5th meeting with Rakrok. Owen was in the tight embrace of one of the frogmen, making it hard for him to breathe, and he shouted desperately, saying that he had done everything they had asked and that it was not his fault that they had failed, to which Shunin, who was walking behind him, replied that it would take too long to lure the lizards. Owen replied that those lizards with black scales and water buffalo skulls on their heads were more cautious than he thought, to which Oboy, who was holding him, said with a sneer that it seemed those were different and were not as naive as his tribe, who had trusted them. Immediately, Owen had no choice but to smile and agree with his words, for it was the truth. The very next moment, Frogman threw him to the ground. Oh, Boy turned to Shunan and said he would go because he had some business left alone with Owen. Shunan told him that his father had ordered him to speed up the sacrifice ceremony, which took Owen by surprise. Shunan went on to say that he should hurry up and get as much information from them as possible and try to invite Rakrok and his warriors to their village as quickly as possible without arousing suspicion. When Owen heard this, he asked in bewilderment, what was the reason for the rush? Thinking to himself that he should listen carefully, since this information was being spread exclusively among the frogmen, he replied that his father's illness and that of the others was getting worse, and that he could not afford to delay it any longer. Owen was surprised at this answer and wondered if he was talking about the itching disease and if she wasn't just making everything itchy. Shunan replied in a slow and serious voice that originally the Lizardmen were not supposed to know, but he could tell him. Then he began the story, explaining that the itching disease was much more frightening and insidious than it might seem at first glance, and if you got it, not only would your skin start to itch, but it would also start to have a sticky white slime on it that wouldn't go away, no matter how much you tried to wipe it off, and it would get bigger and bigger over time. If you were covered with it to a certain level, it became difficult to breathe, and then death would soon follow. That's how a priest in their tribe died yesterday. Owen was surprised to hear this, as he had not heard that the itching disease was fatal, but he realized that it was probably a test, so he could not show his true emotions. It also explained why some of the frogmen hadn't shown up lately, which could even mean that some of them might already be dead, but right now, it was important for him to play his part convincingly. So the very next moment, he said with sadness in his voice that this story should not reach the lizards. He added that if it did, they would laugh at them and also look down on them. Shunan replied that it was true, but they wouldn't be able to hide it forever. After a few seconds of thinking, Owen replied that even so, they had a way to keep the lizards under control, and to do so, they only needed to say that this disease could spread to the lizardmen as well. Hearing that, Shunan replied that it was a good idea, but the problem was that the disease couldn't actually spread to the lizards, to which Owen immediately replied that there were herbs that produced white slime and also caused itching, and if they used them, they could easily fool lizardmen. Their task was to pretend to be weak, and as soon as they took a bite to trap them. After hearing Owen's plan, Shunan was delighted. He patted Owen on the shoulder, praised him, and called him an excellent deceiver, to which he only smiled awkwardly in response. Shunan liked the plan so much that he even promised that if he succeeded in luring out the black-scale lizards, he would unconditionally exclude Owen's children from the sacrifice. When Owen heard this, he happily thanked Shunan and promised to do his best. However, Shunan thought that it would not be enough for the lizard man to do his best and told him that he was afraid that they would need many sacrifices this time, so Owen should try his best to convince them. Owen tensed up, but still decided to ask one more thing. When he heard that, Shunan looked at him incredulously and asked him what he wanted. Owen didn't say right away and started by saying that he realizes it's a complicated request, but he thinks it would be a good idea to bring at least a few bows to the next negotiation to exchange. Hearing this made Shunan grimace with anger. Giving his opponent weapons was definitely not in his plans. The next day, a delegation of frogmen arrived at the Lizardmen village with many supplies and gifts. The tribal leaders and their warriors chatted peacefully among themselves. One of the Lizardmen marveled at the incredibly strong piece of leather to his eyes. It was incredible, and he could not believe that it was a simple gift. Could the frogmen really produce them so easily? At the same time, sitting on the packaged healing herbs, Rakrak declared that these herbs were effective against itching. He was offering all this considerable quantity in exchange for just one bow. Owen looked at their quantity and realized that they must have gathered all the medicinal plants in the area, pretending to think about the offer. Shunin replied that no. Rather than saying, there isn't enough, he said that trading weapons is difficult. After all, it's difficult with a certain level of faith. Rakrak sighed and thought, that's it again, and after a moment's thought, he came up with something. Rakrak formally addressed the frogman leader, saying, Shunan, a son of the great Alroy, for the sake of the faith of both tribes, I have a request to make. His request was a little strange and unexpected. Rakrak wanted to speak to Owen, separately and personally. Shunan looked at his captive with a smile and simply replied, do whatever you want. They seemed to be playing their roles well, and nothing wrong could be seen behind their smiles. But that was not the case. Rakrak wanted to find out what was wrong with them and what the lizard man was hiding, so he led him away from earshot. Their conversation began with Owen telling them that their tribe had joined the tribe of the frogmen through a ritual of brotherhood. Rakrak wondered what that ritual was, but Owen replied that it was a long way off and that they still had plenty of time to get to know each other well. So he asked to tell him all about their tribe, and then he would provide them with as much information about the frogmen as possible. Owen tried to be as friendly as possible and suggested to Rakrak to put aside all doubts and come closer. However, Rakrak noticed a blue butterfly that he already knew, which immediately gave him certain thoughts, but still, he didn't understand why it was here. When it landed on Owen's head, it was clear that Rakrak had to lure him to his side and use him. Owen himself did not understand anything and only asked what this strange butterfly was. After looking at the flying butterfly, Rak finally decided to play a dangerous game. He told Owen that, indeed, there were many doubts and suspicions between them now, so it should be put to an end, and now he would tell him everything about them and their story. The conversation between the two lizardmen went well back at the Frogmen's settlement. Shunan praised Owen and his excellent work, patting him on the shoulder all the time. The results they had achieved with his idea were great. Shunan shrieked with joy as he told them they would come to their settlement when they said they would show them their village. Oh boy, thought they were trying to trap them, but that was just silly. Thanks to the lizards themselves, the frogmen were able to find out the location and size of the village. They even learned some information about their history, even contrary to what the scout had said, that the tribe consisted of 600 men. In reality, there were at most 300, of which only 30 were warriors. The Shunan's guard summarized the heir to the chieftain himself. Had not thought they would trust them, but it was only thanks to Owen that all this had been realized. For such excellent results, Shunan was ready to fulfill any wish of Owen. However, there was a single request for Shunan that Owen had asked for more than once. Shunan asked him what he was talking about, to which Owen shortly reminded him about the promise to let the children go if Owen did the right thing. Shunan promised to let them live together. Oh boy, having heard such a promise, questioned the chief. Did he really say such a thing? To this, Shunan advised him not to be so cruel. His father also understood they shouldn't be so cruel to the lizardmen. He reminded the guard they needed to show the lizardmen that good things would happen if they were served faithfully. Don't be afraid, Owen. I remember the promise, said Shunan, sending him away. Owen was indeed grateful to him for this. The evening came very slowly, with anticipation in his chest. Owen looked at the cage with children from the small slope. Now more than ever before, he wanted to live with his child. However, with the feeling of joy the cats were scratching at his soul, he didn't understand what the problem was. After all, it was natural selection drawing symbols in the sand. He whispered quietly that it was only the fault of the foolish tribe leader of lizardmen, the one called Rakrak. He should have been more suspicious and careful in his movements. Owen frowned. The last time they had met, the leader had shown something amazing that he hadn't seen before, different signs that complemented each other. It's called writing. Rakrak explained he and his tribe had figured out how to use them. Different symbols represented different meanings. Whether it was home or food, 2 crossed-out sticks meant no, the chief said, and a sign that looked like a square root they called a lie or a fake. Owen seemed to dive headfirst into science. He began to ask if 2 letters could be written so close together. He explained his thoughts by saying that if you put them together, they would be "don't lie." The delighted Rakrak said with a smile on his face that he had never thought about it and praised Owen, calling him a clever lizard. To this, he brushed it off, saying that it was a huge praise for him. For some reason, at this moment of praise, he was reminded of Shunan's words when he had called him a smart charlatan. It even became a little hurtful when he came back to reality. However, he realized that the lizard chief had never told Shunan about the writings. He didn't seem to want to show that knowledge to frogmen. But why had he revealed it to Owen, as if reading his mind? Rakrak said it was all just because of faith. The faith that they had used so far between the members of the Lizardmen tribe and the Alroy tribe of frogmen was different. But contrary to that, the only thing he was really interested in was the trust between him and Owen. Owen was visibly crumpling his eyebrows and speaking incoherently. He tried to convey that there was peace between the toads and the lizards, but the leader of the lizardmen interrupted him. He told Owen in a calm voice that he did not believe the information he had told him about the frogmen. There seemed to him to be more hidden in that story than was told Rakrak, and his lizard tribe had known pain as well. They had seen well the creatures that had fallen by the wayside of life and been cast out. They were just like Owen. They had seen more than once the face of a suffering. A stinging tear rolled down Owen's cheek. that he himself didn't notice how moved he was by the words. Am I wrong? Rack asked, calmly, confident in his words, to which Owen replied that it was nothing and asked if he had anything else to say. However, Rakrach didn't need anything else. He had already seen the signs of faith. That's what Owen was thinking about as he looked off into the distance at the river. The leader of the Lizardmen tribe seemed very confident at that moment, but still, it was simply impossible to defeat so many frogmen, and evil spirit Rack even bragged to Owen about defeating a huge ancient Scalopendra, but that seemed useless against those who had beheld and survived against really horrible monsters. The lizards didn't even know how to use a bow, let alone the secret weapons that frogmen warriors have. So carefree that they even talked about their problems without thinking about the consequences. It was a foolish decision. They shouldn't have trusted such a despicable man. Owen summarized getting up from the ground. Even though he'd said he shouldn't be trusted, they kept doing it, driving him the wall. Owen thought he himself was just a charlatan. After one last look at the inscriptions he had been drawing in the sand, he turned around and went back to his tent. By morning, almost all the symbols had disappeared, hiding the fact that someone had been there. A huge commotion went up in the village. A multitude of feet ran from the side, raising a huge amount of dust. Lizardmen arrived in their settlement, shouting out things here and there. Shunan came out to greet them with open arms. To this Rakrach thanked them for such friendly hospitality. He hoped that this exchange would only strengthen the friendship between the two tribes. Shunan also supported his guest's wish. All the lizards came in full gear, spears in hand. Rack was ahead of all questions, and asked them to ignore the fact that they had come with weapons, explaining that he was afraid they would meet Cockatrice halfway. Shunan only mentally gloated at the foolish Lizardmen leader. He thought the idiot wouldn't even believe him if he told him that Cockatrice could not be fought with a spear. Shunan was cunning enough to even think of a plan ahead of time when the banquet began. He was going to get his guest drunk and fire a poison arrow. Rakrach was distracted at this time and asked where Owen was, to which the son of the frogman chieftain shouted at the top of his voice for Owen to appear immediately. He was standing not far from where the banquet was being held and seemed to be drawing something on the ground. There were only lined paths on which the dishes were placed. Crates and bags of food were visible in the background. They seemed to have decided where Rakrach would sit. Sit there. Shunan pointed ahead and asked him to say hello to Owen, and he went to make sure the food was cooked properly. So be it, the lizard replied, pulling a smile onto his face. Getting close enough to him, Rakrach called out to Owen, who was waiting for him to come in his place. Owen wrote some text that needed to be read when Rakrach and the warriors are seated. The banquet will begin, Owen said with a smile to the lizard chief. It sounded like a warning of danger. Owen, however, with his feigned smile, went on to say that it was a fun banquet that would promote peace and friendship between the two tribes. While he was saying all this, he was pointing his stick at his text, which consisted of only one symbol that Rakrach had taught him Lime. They were written all along the length of the seats on which the chief and warriors were to be seated. Taking the hint, Rakrach began to pull the water buffalo's skull over his head while calling out to Yor. The lizard's pupils became as narrow as a cat's, and with anger in his voice, he ordered the warriors to begin. Yor waited for nothing more. Gathering all the strength in his hand, he took masterful aim with his spear. The weapon flew straight into the frog warrior's head. The spear pierced through the skull, causing the body to fall to the ground. Terrifying. The others kill all the frogmen. Rakrach ordered his tribe in a cold and low tone. The warriors moved forward, without hesitation. One by one, the frogs fell to the ground, pinned with spears. They didn't even have time to do anything with their bows. Some of the defeated green creatures turned to Owen before they died, blaming him for he knew everything, branding him a traitor, and blaming him for their deaths. Rakrach's casual face expressed no emotion, only drops of blood dripping from his mask, leaving a trail. In a short time, the entire clearing was strewn with the bodies of frogmen holding arrows on their belts that had not saved their lives. Rakrach walked around the area, listening to the report on the progress of the attack. During the attack on the warriors, many of the frogmen had fled, following Shunan's example, which meant that they would soon be hit by a hail of arrows. "We don't need worry about the arrows, because we have a backup plan," one of the warriors said to the leader, but that was unnecessary, for they had Enrollment said, with a smile on his face, there was something in his plans that he had to do. The tip of the arrow the frogman held was coated with some kind of poison. Shunan and the warriors he'd gathered in the meantime, armed with bows, were heading toward the banquet site where the black-scale lizards would be. He was mad as hell and blamed Owen, who in his opinion was to blame for what was happening. Turning to his warriors, he asked irritably if they had passed on his orders, to which one of his subordinates replied that they had. He reported that he had summoned all the warriors of the village and put them under the command of the Oboy warrior and ordered them to attack the black-scaled lizards, while the lizards in the village were ordered to hold back those until reinforcements arrived. Hearing this, Shunan angrily shouted that they should avenge such meanness from those pointing his finger at the black-scale lizards. He shouted furiously and ordered his men to fire and destroy the enemy at all costs. In the very next instant, a rain of poisonous arrows flew straight towards the Rak tribe. Even if the arrow could not kill the lizard, it would still die from the poison. However, they also had a trump card in the form of the shields each warrior was armed with. The next moment, the arrows hit the shields and fell to the ground with a clang. Shunan and the rest of his warriors were amazed at what they had seen, for they could not have imagined that the black-scale tribe would have anything to counter them, and even more so, that they could neutralize one of their strongest weapons, and one of the weapons of which they were so proud, namely, their bows. Rak and his warriors rejoiced that they had won a small victory. Shunan was angry at his failure, but not about to give up. He ordered his warriors to keep firing if they saw them trying to advance the next moment. However, his attention was drawn to the smoke that appeared out of nowhere. Puzzled, he wondered what was happening. He looked again at where the black-scale lizards were, and found that he could no longer see them properly because of the smoke, which would greatly reduce the effectiveness of their bows. However, there was still one more question, and that was, where was the smoke coming from? At the same time, in the lower village of Frogmen, someone had set buildings on fire with a torch. It was none other than Owen who, with torch in hand, stood watching the fire spread throughout the house. His kin ran up to him and began to panic, asking why he was burning down the village. Seeing that he did not answer, one of them asked if it was also Shunan's order. Owen replied that it was not, but that he had been asked to do so by the leader of the black-scale lizards. Hearing this, his kin were perplexed and shocked, as they could not understand why he had decided to listen to their enemy. Seeing their confusion and panic, Owen told them to calm down and trust him, then informed them that the black-scale lizards intended to crush the frogs. The gray-scale lizards were silent. Owen was the smartest among them, and they realized that even if this trickster risked everything, they should do the same. The tips of the lizards' wooden clubs caught fire, and in the next instant, the village of Frogmen was engulfed in flames. Shunan watched with shock and despair as his village burned. He still could not believe that Owen could betray him, seeing that the grayscale lizards had betrayed them and that their situation was getting worse and worse. Shunan gave his warriors the command to retreat, to which they asked how they could retreat when they had killed their warriors. However, Shunan's priority was his safety, for if heir like him got into trouble, it would most likely be all over for the village. However, since it was the heir's order, they could not disobey so grudgingly. They began to prepare to withdraw. Turning to Shunan, one of them asked if they would join the Oboy warrior. However, he himself did not know the exact answer to this question. Although he had no doubts about his abilities, his intuition told him that in order to get rid of the black-scale lizards, he needed a more reliable way. At the same time, Oboy was confused as the village burned, while there was no word from the warriors preparing for the feast. By his assumptions, Shunan must have been continuing to fight. However, The problem was that the 10 warriors who were in the banquet hall, as well as the 5 others who went to check, were most likely dead. This left Shunan with about 15 more warriors, while there should have been 4 or 5 more on the island. Adding them together and adding his 10 warriors, as well as the warriors from the upper-class village, the total should have been somewhere around 45, which meant that they still had the advantage. Instead of panicking, he began to encourage his warriors by telling them to put more poison on their arrows. After all they had to do was wait for Shunan to arrive, with whom they would retreat. But despite his confident words, his warrior intuition warned him of the approaching danger, and as it turned out, his intuition was not lying. The very next moment, a noise was heard in the bushes nearby. Quickly reacting, he immediately pointed his bow in the direction of the noise, shouting for those who were sitting there to come out, threatening to shoot him. But behind his determination and threats was fear. He had the same feeling he had when he met cockatrice, and his instincts told him to run, but he could not do so for the next instant. 2 large eyes flashed through the bushes on seeing them. Oh Boy immediately ordered his warriors to shoot at them. The warriors released the bowstrings of their bows, and the arrows flew at the enemy. But in the next instant, the faces of all Frogman's Groads, who saw what appeared before them, were filled with fear and horror. Before them was a huge reptile, on the back of which sat several black scale lizards. The creature with an arrow between its teeth seemed to be smiling at them. The lizard behind Joel asked her if the arrow had wounded Manun, to which she smiled and said that it was probably just stuck between his teeth. Manun was still small and still had a habit of chewing everything in his mouth. But this was not the case with the arrow, and he immediately spat it out with a disgruntled look. Whether because the arrow was not tasty enough, or for some other reason, he let out a furious growl. The next moment, Jael pointed to the frightened and desperate frogmen and asked that, hadn't they been a good meal for him? Frogmen, not wanting to die, turned to their commander, Oh Boy, in a panic, asking what they should do, since arrows did not damage the creature. However, he himself did not know what to do. They had no time to think of a better plan for the next moment. Manon jumped on Oh Boy, who was closest to him. He was an experienced warrior, and a second before he died, he managed to dodge, which put the head of his inexperienced kin right in the reptile's mouth. Realizing that this monster was no match for cockatrice, and that it was almost impossible to make eye contact with such a fast creature, he decided to throw poisonous toads into its jaws. Manun, like a dog, seeing a bone thrown to him, instantly caught it and swallowed it, thinking that maybe the reptile was vulnerable to poison. Oh Boy shouted to his warriors to throw all the poisonous toads they had, which they immediately did not, about to give up the free tasty snacks. Manun began to catch the toads flying at him, watching this performance with disdain. Jowl asked the lizard behind her what they were doing, to which he replied that they were throwing poisonous toads from their pouches. But she said that she had seen it herself. But what she was more interested in was why they were throwing their snacks around, which she thought was very strange. After a moment's thought, he replied that perhaps it was an act of goodwill. Jiol grinned wickedly at this, then turned to Manun and told him to explain that it was too late for that. One of the blessings they had received from the god was the blessing of resistance to poisons, which was crucial at the moment, seeing the evil smirk on Manon's face, who was looking at him like he was lunch. Oh Boy realized that his foolproof plan had failed, but there was no time to do anything about it, for in the next instant, the huge reptile leapt at him again, and this time without missing a beat. In the Frogman village, traces of blood could be seen everywhere on the ground, while their houses burned with fire. A frogman sitting in the bushes with a bow was aiming at someone. In the next instant, the arrow was speeding through the air towards its target, which was Rak, who was walking somewhere. However, even though he could not see the arrow coming at him, thanks to his excellent instincts, he was able to sense the approaching danger and reflected it with his massive tail, while Ur, who had arrived in time, neutralized the archer with a single blow. When he approached Rak, he informed him that it looked like this frogman had been the last, adding that Shunin had indeed abandoned the village and fled when he sensed danger. To which Rakrak replied that one of the reasons for this was the betrayal of the grayscale lizards who were currently fighting against the frogmen with them, then adding that even so, they had no right to criticize them as it was their choice. However, what he was really interested in, and what he thought was really strange, it was why, despite the criticality of their situation, the great Alroy they had only heard about did not show up. Sunwoon, who was watching them from above, smiled, pleased with himself, then quietly muttered to himself that it was all because of him. Among the countless tactics and strategies used by him, there was one that was probably one of the strongest in the game, and it was called disease. It worked and was effective in any era. It was a tactic he decided to use this time, even though he had some trouble finding the right virus. Since it was only supposed to work on the mucous membranes of amphibians, he still managed to do it, the time when Rakrak followed Stargazer to the southeast, where the tribe of frogmen was located, coincided with the time when Sun and Youth. Woon discovered the virus, and even though the virus and the frogman tribe were hundreds of kilometers apart, he successfully managed to transport it to them, thanks to his insect army, who, despite many casualties along the way, eventually made it to their village where he first infected their leader, the great Alroy, who has since disappeared. At the same time, the sounds of drums could be heard around the island, banged by several frogmen on the ground near the water. Several bound, grayscale lizard cubs were kneeling, realizing they were here for sacrifice. They tearfully awaited their fate. Not far away, on the ground, sat the great Alroy, whose body was covered with a layer of white slime, and who had initiated the sacrifice that he believed would heal them, together with a crowd of his tribesmen who knelt before the lizard cubs, bowed and begged the two-headed god to accept their sacrifice and to kill all those lizards, thus showing them his greatness. Soon, someone's huge shadow appeared under the water, with two pairs of eyes glowing in it. At the same time, Shunan reached the island by boat and saw that his father had already started the ritual of the sacrifice, which he believed was the key to their victory. At the same time, in the nearly destroyed lower village of the frogmen, Rakrak was called loudly by someone's excited and panting voice. Turning around, he saw Owen, who was breathing heavily from running, praising Owen for a job well done. Rakrak asked him why he was in such a hurry and what he wanted from him. He said with desperation in his voice that they needed to get to the island right away. Rakrak was puzzled as to why they had to get to the island now, and he said that the frogmen had lizard cubs there to sacrifice. Then he added that they had a god, and that if they sacrificed to him, he would come and do them a small favor, and though he might not be able to cure their disease, he would probably attack Rock and his warriors. Rakrak sighed and said that he should have told him about it earlier, for now they had no way to get to the island, for Shunan had taken all the boats in his escape. Owen did not want to give up and started to say that if they swam, they would be able to get to the island. But he was immediately interrupted by the harsh voice of Rakrak, who looked at him coldly and said that it was too dangerous because they had bows and they didn't swim as well as they did. Owen's eyes filled with despair at these words, and in the next instant, his fatherly instinct kicked in, making him beg him to help his son and the other kids. However, this only made Rakrak angrier, who immediately punched him in the jaw. He shouted at him furiously, saying that he should have confided in him earlier and told him everything from the beginning. Then he told Owen, who looked at him with horror and despair on his face, that he believed that they could defeat the god the stupid frogs believed in by their own strength, and that if their god appeared and attacked them, he would show him how they could destroy him. When he calmed down and stopped shouting, he looked pettingly at the still sobbing Owen. Though he couldn't imagine his pain, he knew it was incredibly hard for him, so he just asked if he thought he should have told him earlier so they could have saved his son at the same time. Zhao stopped behind them, and after dealing with Oboy, she got back on Mainin. She immediately turned her worried gaze to the island in the middle of the lake. Owen didn't think Rakrak had said anything wrong, for he realized that things would have changed if he had only been able to learn of Shunan's intentions earlier, and perhaps if he hadn't acted so late, none of this would have happened. In the next instant, the water near the island was churning all. Roy, shouting incomprehensible words, joyfully reached out to the creature that appeared from under the water. This creature turned out to be a two-headed devil, which was their god without wasting time. Alroy immediately pointed to the gray lizard cubs, who, seeing the monster, clung to each other in fear, and then he said in a reverent voice that it was his offering. Raising his hands in the air, he began to shout in a fanatical voice to punish the black-scale lizards who dared to disturb the god's lake. Looking at the huge, two-headed monster that looked invincible to him, Owen finally lost hope. However, while he resigned himself to his fate, Rak, along with Jaol, looked at the two-headed devil with calm gazes despite its enormous size. Rak thought that fighting this huge two-headed serpent might be worth a try. After all, even though they didn't have a location advantage and couldn't use any tricks, they had a chance to win, even if it cost some sacrifices. However, the very next instant, he noticed something that made his eyes widen, wide and glow. A butterfly flew towards him, glowing with a blue light. This could only mean one thing. They had hope. Walking over to the desperate Owen, Rak called out to him and told him to look at him. He raised his head in bewilderment and looked at him with his tear-wet eyes, which widened. The next moment, at what he saw standing in front of the huge mantis that appeared before them in the moonlight. Rak turned to Owen and asked him if he believed in miracles. Kneeling before his god Alroy, shouted loudly to his tribe to worship the two-headed devil. He again began fanatically shouting to the monster to accept their offerings and destroy the lizards. Shunan bowed his head and watched as monster approached the victims, but at one point, the monster stopped in indecision and looked forward with Alroy's experience. This god had always been hungry for sacrifices, and always as if he had been starving for days had rushed at them. But to his surprise, this time, no such thing had happened. Wishing to know what monster was looking at, he followed his gaze and turned around cautiously. His eyes widened at what he saw, and he instinctively froze with fear. There was a large shadow above the tall trees belonging to a huge creature with large eyes, which, at the mere sight of it, inspired awe and terror. The sounds of this creature's movements were accompanied by the cracking sound of trees bursting out of the ground. Ground, which immediately made the frogmen bowing to the two-headed devil turn around like their leader. They also froze with fear when they saw the creature approaching them, shivering in fear. Someone from the crowd loudly exclaimed, "It's new god." Their fear was understandable. Go back to the two-headed demon who was confused and furious when he saw the creature approaching him, because if he let the creature that had invaded his territory stay, he would have to give up frogmen and sacrifices. And so even though his opponent seemed large and strong, he was not one of his arms. The mantis easily, Roy and Shunan, who were watching, had a look of horror on their faces. Then grabbing the serpent's remaining head, which was still showing signs of life, the mantis said he would offer it to his creator so that he could atone for his stupidity was not a sin. In the next moment, illuminated by the bright light of the moon, he pompously tore off its head. Then, under the gaze of all present, turning to the dead serpent, he said that his sins were forgiven by his blood. Message that appeared after his choice made him unconsciously smile. After all, it said that he had obtained a small patch of water. However, the only problem was that he didn't need it now, because the lake had no access to the sea, which made him decide to put it aside for now. A boat pulled away from the shore. The lake was water red with blood in it, sat Alroy, still trying to believe the truth of what was happening. Shunan looked at his father, who seemed to have lost his mind after the death of the serpent. He thought to himself that it was not the disease that had made his father weak, it was the fact that they were completely enchanted by the power of the two-headed devil, who at that moment seemed invincible to them, and at the last moment they did nothing but hide behind him, and when he lost, there was nothing left for them to do. At the same time, Sunwin approached the mantis, who, seeing him and addressing him as the creator, said that he had done his will, to which he continued to look at the island and replied that he had indeed done an excellent job. Then he added that he could rest until the next time he called him. Disappearing, Mantis said in a respectful voice that he would do his creator's will again when the time was right. He looked once more at the lake, which was silent. Sunwoon turned his gaze to Rak Rak and said that he was not the kind of lizard who did nothing at times like this. Seeing the surviving frogmen fleeing in boats to the upper village, Rak Rak cheered his warriors and shouted that they would win a complete victory today. Then asked if there were any volunteers to take them to the upper village of the frogmen. He was immediately approached by Owen, who said that he wasn't that tired yet, and that he needed to meet his son on the island anyway, and said he would do so. But he was not the only one. The next moment, several more gray lizards asked Rak Rak to let him help them as a thank you. He looked at them and replied that their bodies were not fit for battle, and they would not be able to fight. To which one of them replied that he too had once been a warrior, adding that warriors were not the only ones capable of killing frogmen. Then pointing to his kin, who, despite their wounds, were willing to fight, even with sticks in their hands, he said that he might think it was cowardice of them to do so only now, but the sight of them fighting made their hearts burn. The first time they had felt that way since becoming slaves looking at them, Rak Rak replied that it was like a grudge, to which the gray lizard tearfully replied that it was for the hatred and resentment of losing their life companions. Children and grandchildren made them wish the frogmen dead. As he looked around at the gray lizards once more, he realized that few of them had ever held a real weapon, let alone been wounded, but understanding their pain and bitterness, he could not stop them. So in the next instant, he raised his fist and shouted loudly, telling all those who wanted revenge to follow him, followed by the screams of the lizards who were intent on finishing off their abusers once and for all. Rak Rak, along with Jael and Ewer and the rest of the lizards, began to swim across the lake, and soon all 80 lizards that followed their leader had reached the island. Owen was one of the first to get out of the water. He rushed straight to his cub and gave him a big hug, watching the happy and somewhat tearful reunion of father and son. Rak Rak turned to Yor and told him to send those who were tired on the journey with their children back to the boats, and afterwards to take those who could not swim well and take them to the end of the village to attract the attention of the enemy, who must now be watching closely and waiting for their attack. When he heard this, he asked admiringly if their plan was to use one of the squads as a distraction while the main group swam around the water and stabbed them in the back, to which he replied that it was realizing that Rak Rak was taking the hardest part. Yor asked a little worriedly if they would be able to get to the island by water without being seen, to which he replied that they would, as the number of those who were able to fight had dwindled considerably, and there were no more than 10 of them left. After a moment's silence, he added that while they were sailing to the island, he had discovered another blessing from the god. Then turning his gaze to the lake, which reflected the bright light of the moon, he said that their scales would shimmer in the moonlight as the water shimmered, making them much more invisible. Now that they had everything ready, all they had to do was get it over with, once and for all. After a while, all hell really broke loose in the frogman village. Rak Rak's successful plan had worked, and the frogs were taken by surprise, and realizing that they could not win, began to flee in panic. However, not everyone managed to escape, because those who suffered from itching disease and had problems with breathing could not do it. The great leader, Alroy, was no exception. As he looked in despair and incomprehension at the lizards in front of him, who appeared as if from nowhere, the realization of what was about to happen to him brought a look of horror to his face. Soon, the Lizardmen warriors arrived and reached his guards, who were left to protect him. But as it turned out, they didn't stand a chance against the strong and sharp, spear-wielding Lizardmen who dispatched them in the blink of an eye, so fast that the frogmen didn't even have time to fire their bows at them after killing all the guards. Rak Rak looked at the lone Alroy with a cold stare. But even in such a situation, and having long since lost his dignity, he began to scream in despair, accusing the two-headed devil of not saving him despite the sacrifices he had made. But his cries did not last long, for in the next instant, the spear of the reluctant Rakrak was thrust into him, thus ending once and for all the great leader, Alroy, who despite his big name was nothing more than an empty man blaming others for his failures. At the same time, Shunan sat in his tent listening to the war cries of the lizards, as well as the panicked cries of his kin, with terror on his face, shivering with fear. He pondered how it could have happened like this, and how their numerical and weapon advantage had vanished in the blink of an eye. Even the poison that should have been their trump card did not work on the lizards, who were somehow immune to it, but it was too late to think about it because they had already lost after a while. The shouting and noise outside subsided. Deciding that this might be a good chance to escape, he cautiously peeked out of the hut to make sure that there was really no one outside. However, he didn't even realize that the danger was closer than he had imagined. Suddenly, a voice sounded behind him, causing Shunan to freeze in place with fear. In the next instant, he turned around in panic. At the same time, reaching for his quiver, which, unfortunately for him, was empty of arrows, staring with his eyes wide with fear, he shouted the name of the lizard in front of him in desperation. It was Rakrak, looking at him with a cold stare. He told Shunan, if he was a warrior, he should stand up and bear his sword, as it would at least allow him to keep his honor. However, the man had no honor now, and all he could do was just beg to be spared. He immediately panicked and started reminiscing about how they had strengthened their friendship over the last few times they had met, adding that he had no animosity towards the lizards. Rakrak asked thoughtfully if that was true, and he replied that it was because it was the two-headed devil that had threatened them. Seeing that the lizard still seemed unconvinced by his words, Shuning pointed to his bow in a panic, saying he would reveal its secret. To which Rakrak indifferently and coldly asked what the secret was. He immediately replied that it was the bowstring. And when the lizard asked him what the bowstring was made of, he replied with a playful smile that it was made of veins from the backs of frogmen Rakrak. Like Owen, was really shocked at what he had heard, and his face immediately darkened. Even though he had assumed that the bowstrings were made from some animals, he had never imagined that they were made from their kin. The next moment, he asked Shunin, who was sitting in front of him with a smile on his face, what the bow itself was made of. The man, realizing what he was about to say, mumbled that it was from lizards. Shunan lowered his head and prepared to die, for he knew that after his words, he would not be released. Rakrak heard the answer and replied in a cold and grim voice that he understood. Then, opening the curtain at the entrance to the hut and looking out, he said that there were really no hard feelings between them, and he had already won a brilliant victory. So he accepted the deal he had offered. He then looked at Shunan and added that he was free to go. Shunan looked around warily and rose to his feet, still not fully believing that he was being let go. Not waiting for Rakrak to change his mind, he started to run away. Owen, who was standing next to Rakrak, asked him if he was really going to let him go. Rakrak took his bow and arrow and said yes. Then taking aim at the fleeing Shunan, he coldly added that all he needed was a moving target. Not long after the frogmen were finished, Rakrak's arrow whistled through the air. It hit the head of a bound, rotting, and long-dead frogman. Judging by the number of marks, it had long been used as a target for training. Now, Rakra was pleased with the result. His archery skills had improved greatly, and their tribe had found a way to make bows as good as the frogmen. However, he just wondered if this was the best they could do. Even Owen, who had been watching the training, had noticed that the quality of this bow was just as good as the frogmen's, and its arrows flew just as fast and far. Rakrak explained to him that they had achieved all this by replacing the material of the bowstring with frogman tendons. But still, the lizards were physically stronger than the frogmen and could pull the bowstring tighter and risk breaking such a bow, so they should have found stronger materials. Owen understood his desire for a better weapon, but he still reminded him that the bows made by the frogmen were the best that could be made in this forest. There just weren't any better materials here. That's true, Rak said, nodding. Then I guess we can't just stay in this forest. Then, Owen was smart, so he assumed that the reason for this decision wasn't just to make a better bow, and that was indeed the case. Rak explained to Owen that he had learned from the stargazer that this forest area would become very cold as winter came. The lizards would become physically weaker, but would still be able to survive the winter by making fires and wearing the skin of other animals. The problem, however, was their pet, water buffaloes. Rak knew that in nature, water buffalo go to warmer places to avoid winter and find places with enough grass. And to solve this problem, some of them will have to go to warmer places to breed water buffalo. Further, you may have noticed by now that Owen had a skull on his head that was different from those worn by Rak warriors. There were no warriors among the grayscale lizards, but there were definitely those that had the right qualities and abilities to become warriors. Rak had tested and selected them himself, and Owen was one of the gray lizards who had become warriors after passing several tests. These new warriors insisted on using frogmen skulls rather than buffalo skulls, and Rak allowed them to do so. Rak continued practicing and shooting at the target, hitting one arrow after another. Finally, he asked Owen about the results of today's hunt. He replied contentedly that he and his squad had wiped out the remnants of the frogmen hiding in the forest nearby, and now, thanks to their carcasses, there would be no shortage of materials for making bows. Rak was pleased to hear that, however. Owen still couldn't forget what had happened in the village, how he and the other lizardmen, blinded by hatred and rage, had pursued and killed the unarmed and begging for mercy frogmen. Nothing seemed to quench their thirst for vengeance, and their last victim that night was Shunan, who had betrayed his tribe and revealed its secrets and then tried to escape. It was not a pleasant memory, and he was brought out of it by Rak question. He asked Owen what was bothering him. Owen replied that he would like to have Shunan or Alroy's skull as a reward for helping him someday, and asked that the skull not be damaged in training. Rak was fine with that, and promised him that he would be sure to get his strength. Owen was grateful for that, and decided to tell him about an interesting place they had discovered in the forest while hunting. Jewel, meanwhile, came over and quietly leaned over the gray lizard cub who was watching the leader with an unusual figure in his hands. Jael asked quietly, interested in listening to the adults. She frightened the cub. He immediately burst into tears and let go of the figure. Then Jewel asked him what he was doing here and what he wanted to ask the chief. Suddenly, she noticed a figure lying on the grass. She picked it up and asked what it was. It looked suspiciously like the giant praying mantis that their god had sent to help them. Jael showed the figure to Rak, and he also thought the figure looked like their divine protector. They all liked the way the figure was made, and the chief even asked the cub if he had made it himself. Rak praised him, saying that the figure was nice and cute. Hearing this, the cub just glowed with happiness, and then he offered to keep the figure as a gift. But Rak was not sure whether it was worth taking the toy away from the child, and looked questioningly at Owen. He replied that it was fine, and he could accept the gift without any regrets. For the children of his village had been making a lot of them lately. It is even popular among them to exchange such figures. Hearing this, Joel asked the child if there were many children in their village who knew how to make such figures, and he answered her that yes. He explained that it all started because the protector had then saved them all on the island from imminent doom. Now all the children of their village thought of him as a good and powerful being who could protect them from any misfortune. Hearing this, Rak and Jael looked at each other. Rak realized that these figures could be very useful and decided to see how many had been made so far and buy them all. Owen offered to go to their village and see. Rak agreed. He was willing to use all his resources to get more of these figurines. He saw this as an opportunity to spread the belief in their unnamed bug god, but that would come later. For now, Rak wanted to know what Owen's squad had found during the hunt. It turned out that while hunting the frogmen, They had found a strange structure inside one of the caves where some of the frogmen were hiding. It takes about half a day to get there from the lake, and their squad killed all the enemies without much trouble, but the cave was a bit strange. Rack was immediately interested and asked what he meant. Strange in what sense? Owen explained that when they entered the cave, they noticed that there was another entrance that seemed to be carved into the stone, and he himself still doesn't understand how they were able to carve something into solid rock. So he thought then that all should be told to the tribal chief first. It was the right decision. And Rack decided to equip an expedition and explore everything with his own eyes. He returned to the village with Owen and Joel to take a group of warriors with him, and together with them, he set off. Wait, please wait. Hear me out. If you enjoy this video, how about you subscribe, like, and hit that notification button so that you will be able to be notified when I upload another video.